Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for those most inspiring words. And I would actually like to start my brief remarks today by thanking the Churchill College and the organizers of this most interesting conference, especially Dr. Alan Packwood, director of the Churchill Archive Center, for inviting me. As an initial disclaimer, I must perhaps say at the outset that I'm by no means a specialist in matters of religion, even though I had the Institute for Political Studies at the Catholic University of Portugal. However, I certainly am most interested in the specificity of what I like to call the Anglo-American tradition of liberty, especially when the latter is compared with political traditions of continental Europe, which actually ends up being my topic here today. And I happen to believe that the attitude towards religion is one of the core distinctions between the political culture of what Winston Churchill called the English-speaking peoples and the political culture of continental Europe, the democratic political culture of the English-speaking peoples and the democratic political culture of continental Europe. I have to admit that this may indeed seem a bit awkward in the present-day secular world, often called a post-religious world. Nevertheless, the importance of religion was precisely the view presented by one of the best students of the modern democratic age and of its different path in Anglo-America and in continental Europe, especially France. I am, of course, referring to Alexis De Tocqueville in his famous book, Democracy in America, whose first volume was published in 1835. Tocqueville was very clear on the relevance he attributed to religion in America. He actually spoke of the Anglo-American civilization, an expression slightly out of fashion nowadays, and he contrasted it with other democratic experiments in continental Europe, especially France, which was his native country. So allow me to recall briefly some of his impressive words, and I quote, "I have already said enough to put the character of Anglo-American civilization in its true light. It is the product, and this point of departure ought constantly to be present in one's thinking, it is the product of two perfectly distinct elements that elsewhere have made war with each other, but which, in America, they have succeeded in incorporating somehow into one another and combining marvelously. I mean to speak of the spirit of religion and the spirit of freedom. Far from harming each other, these two tendencies, apparently so opposed, advanced in accord and seemed to lend each other a mutual support. Freedom sees in religion the companion of its struggles and its triumphs, the cradle of its infancy, the divine source of its rights. Freedom considers religion as the safeguard of mores, and mores as the guarantee of laws and the pledge of its own duration." Unquote. So these were the impressive words of Tocqueville about the centrality of religion and its association with liberty in what he called the Anglo-American civilization. In my presentation today, I would like to discuss briefly the reasons why Tocqueville thought this was a central question. And I will then conclude with some conjectural factors that may explain, in my view, why the association of religion and liberty is much less present, to use an euphemism, in continental Europe. In support of my conjectures, I will draw on the works of Karl Popper on the distinction between critical and dogmatic rationalism, as well as on Michael Oakeshott's distinction between civil association and enterprise association. So, starting with Tocqueville's views on the role of religion in a democratic age, I should like to argue that Tocqueville ascribed three main roles to religion in the democratic age. These roles, which he saw at work in America and whose absence in France he lamented, can be described as follows. First, religion, according to Tocqueville, counters the cultural tendency to lowering our sights, which is a threat that Tocqueville perceives in an age of equality. Second, religion produces moral and voluntary self-restraint, which Tocqueville perceives as a fundamental condition of enduring and self-sustaining liberty. Third, religion limits the scope of the state, whose growth Tocqueville describes as a threat to liberty in a democratic age. So starting with the role of religion in countering the lowering of our sights, Tocqueville developed a long and detailed analysis of what he described as the, quote, the excessive care for worldly welfare, unquote. He perceived this excessive concern for material well-being as a powerful trend in the modern democratic age. And he argued that, quote, if men were ever to content themselves with material objects, it is probable that they would lose by degrees the art of producing them, unquote. In contemporary sociological terminology, I think one could say that Tocqueville was detecting a tendency to replace the ethics of deferred gratification, which he observed in America, with the ethics of instant gratification. Tocqueville then argued that the spirit of religion is a powerful antidote against instant gratification. He said that, quote, most religions are only general, simple, and practical means of teaching man the doctrine of the immortality of the soul, unquote. This doctrine has powerful consequences, Tocqueville argued, at the secular level, so much so that it actually explains, according to Tocqueville, why religious nations have so often achieved such lasting results. And I quote again from Tocqueville. In ages of faith, the final aim of life is placed beyond life. So this is Tocqueville's words. And I continue quoting. When these same men engage in the affairs of this world, the same habits may be traced in their conduct. They do not turn from day to day to chase some novel object of desire, but they have settled designs, which they are never weary of pursuing, unquote. In other words, because they look beyond instant gratification, people of religious faith are led or tend to be led in this world to adopt an ethics of deferred gratification. This, in its turn, and somewhat paradoxically, is and has been the key to material prosperity. So this is the first role that Tocqueville ascribed to religion. Now, the second secular role Tocqueville ascribes to religion is that of moral self-restraint. And I quote, the founders of New England were at once ardent sectarians and exalted innovators. While held within the tightest bonds of certain religious beliefs, they were free from all political prejudices. Thus, in the moral world, everything is classified, coordinated, decided in advance. In the political world, on the other hand, everything is agitated, contested, uncertain. In the one, there is passive, though voluntary, obedience. In the other, there are independence, contempt for experience, and jealousy of every authority, unquote. At this point, as in so many others, Tocqueville seems to join, in my view, Edmund Burke, who famously said that every society needs somewhere a power of control, and the less that power of control comes from within, the more it will come from without. This is exactly what Tocqueville is saying about the moral role of religion in underpinning a free political system. Because religion provides voluntary moral self-restraint, it generates order from within. The main justification of authoritarian governments, usually the alleged need to impose law and order, is then removed by religious self-restraint. This is why Tocqueville says that, quote, freedom sees in religion the companion of its struggles and its triumphs, the cradle of its infancy, the divine source of its rights. It considers religion as the safeguard of mores, and mores as the guarantee of laws and the pledge of its own duration. We now turn to the third secular role that Tocqueville ascribed to religion, which I would like to call pluralism. At this point, one must briefly recall Tocqueville's fear of a new despotism that could emerge in the age of equality. And these are these famous words, I quote, I see an innumerable crowd of like and equal men who revolve on themselves without repose, procuring the small and vulgar pleasures with which they fill their souls. Above this, an immense tutelary power is elevated, which alone takes charge of assuring their enjoyments and watching over their fate. It is absolute, detailed, regular, far-seeing, and mild. So it is that every day it renders the employment of free will less useful and more rare. Thus, after taking each individual by turns in its powerful hands and kneading him as it likes, the sovereign extends its arms over society as a whole. It covers its surface with a network of small, complicated, painstaking, uniform rules through which the most original minds and the most vigorous souls cannot clear a way to surpass the crowd. It does not tyrannize, it hinders, compromises, enervates, extinguishes, dazes, and finally reduces each nation to being nothing more than a herd of timid and industrious animals of which the government is the shepherd. End quote. This is not the place to discuss in detail Tocqueville's important insights into the threat of what is sometimes called the tyranny of the majority. But the most relevant point to our discussion, I think, is the remedies he found in democratic societies against the threat of egalitarian despotism. And these remedies were mainly two. First, the art of a spontaneous association, and second, religion. In this case, clearly Judeo-Christian religion. Both of them, spontaneous association and freedom of religion, would be sources of pluralism and sources of what we now call vibrant civil societies. And Tocqueville believed that strong civil societies would be the most robust anchor of liberty, because strong civil societies would be a decisive rampart against intrusive, big and unlimited government. Religion, Christian religion, in its turn, denies to political power a sovereign claim to complete authority in all human affairs. For this reason, Tocqueville famously said that, quote, while despotism may govern without faith, liberty cannot. Okay, so I have just a couple of minutes, yes?
Yes.
Now, so having discussed briefly the three crucial roles that Tocqueville ascribed to religion in democratic America, I now would like to address briefly the question of why did not the spirit of religion and the spirit of freedom combine each other in a similar manner in continental Europe, especially in the French Republican tradition. And I have 2 minutes to explain my view on this. The answer, in my view, lies not in some conspiracy theory about allegedly atheistic Euro elites, but in the predominant political culture of most continental European democracies. And as a continental European myself, I regret that these political cultures seem to lack the open-mindedness, the easygoingness, and even untidiness, to borrow a phrase from the late Ralph Dahrendorf, who was my German-British supervisor at Oxford. So the open-mindedness, easygoingness, and untidiness that one can find in greater measure in the political cultures of what Winston Churchill liked to call the English-speaking peoples. I realize that I'm merely gesturing here at what would have to be a long and complex argument, one that would need to reckon with traditions and experiences that go back a long way and are much at variance with one from another. I would have to chart and compare what the distinguished American historian Gertrude Himmelfarb calls different paths to modernity and what Karl Popper called dogmatic rationalism as opposed to critical rationalism. To simplify dramatically, one could say that the Anglo-American enlightenments, plural, differed from the continental, mainly French, enlightenments in at least one crucial point. Whereas the Anglo-American enlightenments, actually Scottish, mainly Scottish-American enlightenments, were skeptical, including skeptical about reason itself, or in other words, aware of the limits and fallibility of reason, the French Enlightenment was mainly dogmatic or comprehensive. It embraced a comprehensive, non-skeptical faith in reason. From this non-skeptical faith in reason, the continental, mainly French Enlightenment, adopted a correspondent non-skeptical faith in politics and therefore in the state, once politics and the state could be led by enlightened reason. The political consequence of this has been that in continental Europe, democratic elites have tended to perceive democratic politics as a means to achieving a purpose. It usually is a noble purpose, to be sure, but it still is a purpose. It usually is related to modernization or to the enlightenment of European peoples, to which religion tends to be perceived as an obstacle. Religion, therefore, tends to be perceived as an obstacle to the purpose ascribed to democracy, the purpose of freeing people from non-rational traditions and prejudices, the purpose of secularization and modernization, if you will. This perception creates a sort of intrinsic tension between what Tocqueville called the spirit of liberty and the spirit of religion. The public square then tends to be associated with state institutions, les institutions de la République, which, in their turn, adopt an adversarial attitude towards religion. And I'm just about to finish, Mr. Chairman. Among the English-speaking peoples, by contrast, democracy is less a means to an end than an ethos and a way of life. The distinction that I'm drawing here, and in a very simplified manner, is not unlike one that Friedrich Hayek and Michael Oakeshott drew in a different context between a made or teleocratic order or enterprise association, which has a unifying purpose, and on the other hand, a grown or nomocratic order or civil association, which has no goal, but instead is held together, as the term nomos suggests, by a tissue of laws, conventions, and customary practices. In the context of a grown or nomocratic order, a civil association, the only possible purpose of democracy among the English-speaking peoples could be said to be safeguarding the inalienable rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, as Thomas Jefferson and the Second Continental Congress put it in the Declaration of Independence. This, however, is more a procedural than a substantive purpose. For this reason, among the English-speaking peoples, it just happens, it is just a fact of life, that democracy will sometimes go in one direction, while at other times it will head towards a different and maybe even opposite point of the compass. No external substantive purpose, therefore, can be identified with democracy. Different, often opposing purposes enter into the realm of democratic controversy and rivalry, the realm of parties, elections, legislatures, and vibrant civil societies. In other words, if religion is present within civil society among the English-speaking peoples, its free expression in the public square will be perceived as a normal feature of a free society and a normal consequence of the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. Excellent.